Welcome to the meeting of the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Management Board taking place on the 10th of February 2022. The meeting is being broadcast live through our YouTube channel. Before we commence with today's formal business, I would like to cover some of the housekeeping issues for us all to follow. Can I ask everyone to switch off or make silent their mobile phones? Please keep microphones switched off at all times unless you're invited to speak by myself, the chair, and make sure you turn it off once you're done speaking. Also make sure to introduce yourself so everybody who's watching knows who you are. Moving on to the agenda. Item 1, apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies?
Thanks, Chair. We have apologies from Councillors Coslett, Gunn and Shaw.
Thank you very much. Are there any substitute members?
We have Councillor Roberts for Councillor Shaw.
Thank you very much. Item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of January 2022, page 3. Can we agree the minutes as a correct record?
Agreed, Chair.
Oh, so, Councillor Beattie?
Chair, yes. The paragraph on page 13, paragraph 55, where I referenced Storm Arwen, it actually stipulates Councillor Beattie mentioned the call for. I actually specifically requested a call for a public inquiry, so our request mentioned is actually changed.
It's not a problem. I have no issues with that. Are there any other issues with the minutes? Thank you very much. We'll take them as per the request for the amendment. We'll take them as agreed. Okay. Next, are there any matters arising? Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, Tom Gorman, Corporate Strategy and Scrutiny Manager. There's a couple of items, Chair, with reference to the substantive item on the agenda today, which is the MTFP update. Councillor Crute raised an issue at the last board. Would like the board to have the opportunity to respond to the fair funding review, just to confirm that this will be built into and developed as part of the timetable for the development of MTFP 13. And on the same page, a question by Councillor Jackson, which was around a car parking review. I think he was on about the Free After Two initiative in Durham City and whether that might be extended to other towns. I can add that discussions are continuing with Regeneration and Economic Growth Service, who hope to be able to confirm the timeline for the review of the strategy in the next couple of months. And members will also note there's a summary of the comments made by this board at the last meeting on the 2 cabinet reports covering the development of MTFP 12, the comprehensive spending review and the provisional local government settlement, which were included in paragraph 90 on page 46 of the cabinet report, which went to cabinet yesterday and is part of the papers for the board today.
Thank you, Tom. All right. I've missed item 4, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No, thank you very much. So let's move on to the main item of the agenda, item 5, the MTFP 22-23 to 25-26, the Revenue and Capital Budget 22-23, report of the Corporate Director of Resources. Thank you very much, Jeff Garfield, for coming back again and giving us a talk through the kind of final budget proposals.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yes, I'm Jeff Garfield. I'm the County Council's Head of Corporate Finance and Commercial Services. Yeah, it does feel a little bit like coming into the mastermind seat every time we come down into scrutiny and question by yourselves, so a good, healthy process. The first test, Chair, is obviously we've been through this report numerous times in my team, looked at this report hundreds of times, double-checked it, thought loads of times. I've read it this morning and found 5 errors, so if anybody can spot one of my errors in this report, well done to everybody, and let's see if anyone's managed to pick any of them up. So, we did say at the last meeting, which obviously isn't too long ago now, we did go through a lot of the things in the previous report in detail. So just for everybody, obviously I'll not be covering lots of things in detail like we did a few weeks ago. So I will just try and pick up on the major kind of changes, new information that's in the report. One thing to note, Chair, as the report does reference, we were expecting the final settlement, probably in between Cabinet and final Council meeting. And we got the final settlement from Government on Monday, came in at 6:30 of an evening. And as we thought, no significant change in the final settlement. Having gone through the information, the council is going to receive, we think, around £15,000 more in funding than what we had in the provisional settlement. So on the basis of a figure of that nature, insignificance in terms of our total budget, we don't intend to change any of the budget information that we've got in this report. So, as I said, I'll not be picking up lots of things that we covered last time, but more than happy, Chair, to pick up any questions anybody's got on any part of the report. So, I'm going to walk through the report. Thankfully, everyone will know, not page by page, just referencing some of the key issues I want to touch upon this morning. So, within the, a reminder within the exec summary of the report, paragraph 2A, we have received, excuse me, a significant chunk of extra cash as a council for next year, so almost £20 million of additional funding has been identified for the council. Issues for us to consider, which we discussed last time, 8.8 million almost of that funding is one-off, and that one-off nature very much linked into the fact the government have announced the intention to go through with a fair funding review throughout 2022 for an expected implementation in 23-24. And 1.9 million of the new funding we've got is linked to new burden, which I'll touch upon as I go through the report. So in terms of kind of firm funding that we're receiving additional that we can rely upon, which doesn't have liabilities, we're probably talking about £9 million. Which again, it's good to receive budget uplifts, when in the past, as all cabinet, council colleagues will be aware, we have been receiving reductions in funding for quite a while. Paragraph 2B points out that we are facing significant unavoidable base budget pressures, and well beyond any which I've encountered since I've been carrying out this role. So pay and price inflation, we've put £13 million into the budget, £12 million extra for adult social care services, particularly linked to fee uplifts for the private sector. We have got the Employers' National Insurance uplift next year coming in, and we are putting additional funding into the budget linked to our capital programme in terms of prudential borrowing. There is some prudent investment in frontline services within the report, which we've been able to afford based upon the prudent position we're taking. In line with previous years, we continue to review our reserve position. So again, we've reviewed earmarked reserves to ensure that they are fully committed, and the report will pick up areas where we've been able to look at earmarked reserves and move them around and put them into new priorities. Again, as always, a significant capital investment within this report, which we hadn't touched upon at scrutiny previously, so I will touch upon that as we go through the report. The last report to Cabinet, which scrutiny discussed, put in an indicative 3% council tax increase for next year, and that is firmed up in this report, and again I will touch upon that in the detail. So, just picking up again some of those key issues from the Comprehensive Spending Review back in October. 1.5 billion extra funding for local government per annum over the next 3 years, which obviously at that point was welcome. We were waiting what the detail that would mean. Additional social care precept, adult social care precept for 22.3 of 1%, and importantly an indicative 1% extra for adult social care precept for 23.4 and 24.5, in addition to the 2% referendum limit. So within our MTFP planning at the present time, we are forecasting that the council will go for a 2.99% council tax increase in 23.4, 24.5. Important to say, Chair, that isn't setting the council tax for those years. It is simply indicating those for MTFP modelling purposes. As paragraph 9 picks up a significant increase in the national living wage for next year of 6.6%. I guess many of us would say with inflation running at 6 or 7% soon, that's just about the level it should be increasing by. At the same time, obviously that has a massive impact on council costs, mainly linked to the price we need to pay for purchasing care in the private sector. We've built in assumptions in our planning for future years of a national living wage increase every year of 5%. Again, if those figures end up being higher, that will place additional pressure upon the council in the future. I'll pick up within the report again just some of the issues around the funding we're receiving linked to the new health and social care levy and what new burdens that brings for the council. So the settlement itself, as we discussed last time, In line with our fears, again, it's only a one-year settlement for local government, so it's great to get some extra funding, notwithstanding a big chunk is one-off, but it isn't enabling us to plan in a firm fashion because of the one-off nature. That one-off nature of the funding is very much linked, as I mentioned previously, to our expected position on the Fair Funding Review. So we're expecting consultations to come out across the spring in terms of the Fair Funding Review for a likely implementation in 23-4. Got to say, at the present time, we've received nothing since the settlement from government in terms of how that's going to work. No timetables, no information on when it's going to happen, which is slightly concerning. The later the information comes out, the harder it's going to be for us to lobby heavily on that if it isn't a good position for the council. And in line with Councillor Croot's view from previously at Scrutiny, yourselves have asked to be part of any assessment process of what that means. So again, if information comes out really late with very short consultation timeframes, it's going to squash our chance for looking at that in detail with colleagues, partners, and other agencies, and with Scrutiny. So I'm hoping that something comes out in the near future in terms of that timetable. As I mentioned, 42% of the funding that we've received from the additional funding announced in the Comprehensive Spending Review is brand new funding, recurrent for the Council. So that's important, came via the Social Care Grant, where we received 8.1 million. But the new services grant that's come out, where we're receiving 8.8 million, that's a one-off funding. And again, that's one-off to enable the government in 23-4 and beyond to implement the Fair Funding Review, but to transition it in. So those authorities who are major losers from that process, the impact of that could be transitioned over a number of years. So the government will use that services grant funding to enable that transition period. So in our financial planning, it's important to say in 23-4, we are assuming we lose every penny of that £8.8 million. Our view being at this point that that's a prudent position to take because we may receive none of that funding at all. So that's the basis of our planning going forward. The additional investments that I mentioned previously, there's information in the executive summary from paragraph 24 and obviously full detail within the report. We also referenced in the additional investment section of the exec summary that review that we've done in terms of earmark reserves. And again, I'll pick up one or two issues within the body of the report. And the final two things to pick up, I think, in the exec summary, one around capital investment, I'll mention that in my detail, and then particularly around the council tax position that the council is taking with a 3% council tax increase. Important to state that the council is taking full benefit of the adult social care precept. So we deferred 2% from this year, an additional 1% we can use next year. So the 3% council tax increase the council is agreeing or seeking agreement for next year is fully utilising the adult social care precept. The county council could have increased council tax by an additional 2% up to the referendum limit, but for next year that isn't the recommendation that is coming forward. In terms of impact for that, that will generate just over £7 million extra funding for the council. The Band D increase will be 98p per week. The Band A increase, which is 57% of people who live in Durham, will be at 65p per week increase. So, yes, we're still facing challenges as a council, but at the same time, we've been able to bring forward a balanced budget through Cabinet and into Council. We've got some reinvestment of earmark reserves. We're continuing with our very strong local council tax reduction scheme, so no changes again, agreed with by Cabinet back in November. In addition, as colleagues will be aware, for the last 2 years using government funding, we've been providing an additional discount of £300 on our council tax in the county. We're maintaining that next year at £150 to provide additional support as we go forward. Lots of investment in our capital programme that we will pick up, but again, a balanced budget for next year, but still clouds on the horizon in terms of financial settlements going forward, linked to the uncertainty associated with long-term settlements not being in place and what the likely impact of the Fair Funding Review could be. So, Chair, I'm just going to pick up now some of the detail within the report. So the first one is just looking at Table 1, above paragraph 60. This is particularly looking at the new funding that the council is going to receive linked to the Health and Social Care Levy. So Scrutiny will be aware the government is increasing national insurance for employers and employees from April. Lots of talk about that probably or possibly being deferred, but it appears that the Treasury is still going to push ahead with that for next year. From that, local government are going to receive elements of that funding. The vast majority will go to the NHS to help with the backlogs, but some of that funding comes to local government. The table at Table 1 provides detail of how the £2 billion of funding by 24-25 will be payable to local government. So £600 million of that funding is coming to local government to enable local authorities to increase care fees to the private sector through what's called a fair cost of care process. So we've been advised to access this funding, the County Council must carry out a fair cost of care process with care providers across 2022, with the expectation of implementation of new fees within 23-24. The total sum coming forward nationally for that is around 600 million. We're estimating we could receive around £7 million of that funding, which at a high level would afford an increase in care fees of around 4%. Needless to say, care providers in the county and across the country will be expecting care fee increases from a fair cost process significantly in advance of 4%. So our concern is going to be, as we go through the next year, if those exercises come up with a significant increase in fee above 4%, there will naturally be an affordability issue for local government. Every 1% that we increase our care fees, if we're talking residential care, home care, daycare, we're talking close to £2 million for every 1% extra that we have to fund. So that's a significant risk for us in the medium term. In addition, as Scrutiny will be aware, we've discussed previously, the government are bringing in a cost cap in terms of the maximum amount an individual can be charged for care of £86,000, and also the means test cap, which presently sits at £23,500, will be increased to £100,000, with those things coming in from October 2023. So at that point, councils will be expected to pay much more money to care homes, because the care homes will be unable to charge that to individuals. So that will increase our costs significantly. And also, as we discussed previously, self-funders who pay £170 a week on average more than the County Council does through our contract in the future can come onto council contracts. So again, we have no idea what share of the 1.4 billion we're going to get. We'll probably find that out in the next settlement, and again we'll be comparing that against what we think the impact's going to be for the council. So within that framework, there are some significant risks for the council still in terms of what that might mean for the future. And again, we'll be unable to really assess that until we've gone through the fair cost process and we've gone through the next settlement. In terms of, I'll mention negative RSG, Chair. A number of authorities in the country, as mentioned in paragraph 65, are presently receiving additional funding from government more than what the settlement funding assessment says they should receive. It is likely that the councils who receive significant negative RSG funding may well be the authorities who end up losing in fair funding, because they're being presently protected more than the funding they should receive nationally. So this is the last year we'd expect to see negative RSG funding on the basis of the fair funding review coming in for 23-24. And again, as Scrutiny will be fully aware, the County Council does not receive any funding from negative RSG. Core spending power, we discussed this again last time. I will just draw Scrutiny's eyes to Table 3, where we see there the core spending power comparisons. Obviously, the key one for the County Council there would be that we're well below the England average. And for an area of high deprivation, or much higher than the national average, we'd expect to be above the England average when it comes to core spending power. I'm sure everybody noted in the title there of Table 3, one of my first errors, it should be the 2022-3 core spending power per dwelling and not the 21-22. Moving on to the consultation process that we've gone through, which obviously scrutiny being a key part of that. This is picked up from paragraph 77. Colleagues will be aware in the past the Council's often done very, very detailed consultation, particularly through the period 2011 to 2016, when the Council was having to find significant savings, often impacting upon frontline services. And in those circumstances, there was intensive consultation throughout the year, and particularly intensive consultation on individual plans. And for MTFP 12, we weren't really in a position to go out and do detailed consultation. One, due to the uncertainty of where we were in terms of the comprehensive spending review, the settlement coming in so late, and indications were at that point the Council wasn't going to need to find additional or significant additional savings for 22-23. So we took the view of taking a high-level consultation process through our AAPs and with partners throughout January period. All of our AAPs had sessions on the budget, and I've got to say there was some very interesting and useful feedback came from that in terms of their views. Paragraph 81 there identifies what the key questions were, and really saying to colleagues, in balancing our budget for 22-3, at that point we thought we had around a £7 million shortfall. Should we go for council tax increases, or how would that be balanced between finding additional savings, or possibly using reserves to balance the budget, as the council has done on a number of occasions in the recent past. The feedback from those sessions was very interesting in terms of the views of each AAP. What we found was there were a number of AAPs who very clearly thought that the 3% council tax increase was a reasonable thing to do. In addition, a number thought that was reasonable, but there was some quite reasonable challenge that came from AAPs in terms of feedback from them in terms of improving our consultation for the future, ensuring our communication is effective, and also some colleagues identifying areas where they thought the council should seek extra efficiencies for the future to ensure that we keep finding funding to help the council balance budgets in the future. Also in the report is the initial scrutiny feedback, which we had from previous sessions. That's in paragraph 90. And again, Chair, after this session, no doubt you will wish to update that in terms of what we put into the full council report. So, just moving on to the base budget pressures the council are facing next year. They are detailed within paragraph 104. And again, we've gone through these in detail at previous scrutiny sessions. I don't think there's any of the things in this report, Chair, that will surprise scrutiny colleagues. So we can see there in the table 4, £45.1 million of additional unavoidable budget pressures for next year. As I said, never seen a position where we've had pressures of such a large extent. In terms of pay inflation there, we're assuming 3% for next year. Obviously, that's a very kind of finger in the air estimate of what it might be. If local government staff are given a 3% pay increase next year with inflation running at 6 or 7%, obviously that's a very difficult position for our colleagues to be in place. Interesting to see the Bank of England boss coming out and saying everyone should restrain pay awards for next year. It'll be interesting to see what happens in that regard. As I mentioned previously, £12 million for adult social care fee uplifts, particularly linked to the national living wage. We're expecting, even without the fair cost of care process, to face significant pressure from our care providers for fee uplifts well in advance of the sum we've got in the budget. Negotiations in that regard are ongoing. Energy increases, we've got £3.1 million in the budget. That's based broadly on a 50 to 60% increase in our energy costs for next year. I think, as I mentioned, the scrutiny previously, every day you look at the price, particularly of gas, it's moving up and down in a very volatile fashion. So we'll have to keep a very close eye on that. We've got some significant waste disposal pressures in our budgets for next year. They're mainly linked to increased tonnages that we're facing right now, which aren't reducing on the back of coming out of lockdown periods. And we have 2 or 3 of our major waste disposal contracts up for re-procurement next year. And based upon benchmarking and what other councils have done recently in terms of their re-procurements, we are expecting some significant pressures to come into that budget area. Want to pick up near the bottom there, which I'll mention later on in terms of capital. There's £3 million in the budget for 22-3 for prudential borrowing, and that borrowing is paying for big chunks of our capital programme. So again, that is linked to the major capital investments that the council is seeking for the future. In terms of frontline service investments that I mentioned previously, we've got those from the paragraph 111 onwards. As I say, they were mentioned and detailed in previous cabinet reports. Not significant sums in terms of £45 million of base budget pressures, but £3.2 million of frontline investments, mainly within our neighbourhoods service. In terms of MTFP M12 looking forward, we do have some savings that we've put into the budget for 22-3. We had £1.5 million of savings already agreed from previous MTFPs, and there's extra savings of £1.2 million in the budget for next year, taking the total savings in MTFP seeking agreement in this budget round of £2.7 million. As I'll touch upon later, however, we're still forecasting savings in the future of £30 million. The good news is that's the lowest figure I've ever had in an MTFP in terms of future challenge. We have had figures significantly in advance of that in the past, but it is still important to note the significant uncertainty for the council, and we are still facing significant budget pressures as we go forward. So in terms of the council's net budget requirement, this is picked up from paragraph 115. The table at table 6 in the report gives all of the funding that the council has in terms of funding our core base budget. The revenue support grant at £29.1 million. Colleagues will recall 10 years ago that was £167 million, and that is the key funding stream that the councils had reduced in recent years as part of funding reductions. The Section 31 grant figure there of £25 million, that is the funding the government is providing to us at the present time in the main because of the significant business rate discounts that are allowed to businesses next year as we recover from COVID. We get or can keep locally 49% of all business rates that are raised in the county. So when the government applies additional discounts, a funding stream called Section 31 grant has to be provided to the council. That Section 31 grant also covers issues such as in recent years, business rates should go up by inflation every year, but the government often has been capping those at 0%. So again, because we would have received that funding through business rates, we get it as a Section 31 grant. So our council tax forecast total, based upon the 3% increase, is £252 million, which, as you can see, is an ever-growing percentage of our net budget requirement. So the same as all local authorities across the country, we are becoming more and more funded from our council tax more than many other funding streams. So our total net budget requirement present forecast for next year of £466,732,000. Taking colleagues to paragraph 130, we've done an analysis in this report, which was in previous reports, linking the funding we are receiving from for adult and children's social care and comparing that with our additional investment, really trying to identify, can we justify a 3% adult social care precept. As colleagues can see, we're receiving £17 million of targeted funding, either from social care grant increase, adult social care precept, or from the market sustainability grant. Our total investment in social care next year is £19.5 million additional on top of our base budget. Taking colleagues to paragraph 137 and just looking ahead to the pressures and the challenges we face for the future. In table 8, we've got a current forecast savings shortfall next year of £16.6 million. That figure is obviously very volatile in terms of what base budget pressures the council could face in 23-4, what happens with inflation as we go forward, but particularly what happens in the fair funding review. And as I did mention, we have forecast that we'll lose £8.8 million of our funding, which we'll get next year from one-off sums. Colleagues will be aware in the past we've always assumed we're going to be a loser from fair funding. We've taken that out of our assumptions going forward, but have built in an assumption that we lose that one-off grant of £8.8 million. So the reality could be we could lose more, we could lose nothing, we could get extra funding. Until we get through that fair funding review, it's impossible to say, and that's why obviously that is very important that we receive that information and timetable as quickly as we can from government. An important thing to note that we do have a budget support reserve still in place. We've just put an extra £2.6 million into this budget support reserve, taking it to £15.3 million. That particularly being in place to support the council in the coming years if we have to end up in a situation of having to find £30 million of savings. All colleagues in Scrutiny, I'm sure, will be fully aware. The council's driven significant efficiencies in the past, and there's in no circumstance could the council find efficiencies or extra income of £30 million. If we end up in a circumstance of finding savings of that nature, it will naturally impact upon service provision. The budget support reserve is always going to be in place in the short term to enable us to plan effectively and carry out robust consultation on any change the council seeks to implement in the future. There's a section in this report on financial reserves, which in the past has been an interesting discussion in Scrutiny. So at table 9, we have details of the most recent review we've carried out into earmark reserves and one-off budget investments that we've had in the past. As part of that, we've released £14.9 million by reviewing reserves and their commitments. £4.9 million of that has gone into putting more money back into the budget support reserve, putting funding into the ERVR reserve, again linked to what challenges we could face in the future. As a council, we've spent over £50 million of reserves in the last 10 years on ERVRs. So in terms of downsizing the council and losing 3,000 posts, we've had to spend £50 million on severance packages. We've put some more money into the commercial reserve and also replenished the Lumiere reserve to enable another event to be held in 2025. In total, therefore, that has released £10 million to invest in new priorities. With that 10 million, 3.6 million broadly is going into capital, and paragraph 147 identifies where that funding is being invested into. So within the recommendations in that section of the report, we are recommending again that we seek to maintain our general reserve in the medium term between 5% and 7.5% of our net budget requirement. Net budget requirement being the £466 million I mentioned previously, although as Scrutiny will be aware, our actual gross expenditure spend is well over £1 billion. So on that basis, we'll be seeking to hold the general reserve between 23 and £35 million. I think at quarter 2, we report the Cabinet, I think we're at £26 million in general reserve. As we always say, the general reserve is there for a rainy day. Maybe looking at what's happened in the last 6 months, we should say for a stormy day. And we've often been asked in the past, well, when's this rainy day ever going to happen? I guess we've only got to look back at the last 2 years of the pandemic to understand that rainy days do occur sometimes. So, the capital budget, which picks up from paragraph 151, the current capital budget, as it was last reported to Cabinet, is at table 11. So at that point, we had a capital budget of £489 million. In taking forward our considerations for MTFP 12, we've looked at all funding available to support our capital programme for MTFP 12. At paragraph 12, we've identified the additional grant funding that we are seeking to support our capital programme. And it's important to note, as always, the capital programme, when we're looking at bids, we're always looking 2 years ahead. There's not much benefit in putting capital bids in for next year and putting the money in the budget for next year, because it takes often so long to plan a capital scheme. It makes much more sense to plan in advance. So when we're looking at capital bids in MTFP 12, we're looking mainly at capital bids for 2023-24. Notwithstanding, there's always some issues that we pick up in the following year, but it's mainly looking 2 years ahead. So in terms of capital grants here, these are capital grants we are expecting to get in 23-24. So we get Disabled Facilities Grant of £6 million. That's invested to assist adults to stay in their own homes rather than going into any kind of care facility. We're receiving about £17 million grant for our highways, £5.5 million of funding for school maintenance, which I'm sure anybody who's on a school governing body will say is nowhere near the sum that the council really needs to maintain our school framework and buildings. And we get £1.2 million school devolved capital. That money isn't council money, that's school money and goes direct to all of our schools. In line with the last couple of years, we're not building in any assumption of extra capital receipts for the council. The council doesn't have masses of land to sell right now, and because of where we are in terms of land values, there's nothing being put in additional in terms of capital receipts forecast for MTFP 12. We have got some one-off revenue funding we're putting into the capital programme. Scrutiny will be aware that the council previously in a review of reserves had put in £20 million into the town and village reserve. Some of that funding of £3.2 million is being built into the capital programme. And also, as I mentioned, from the earmark reserves review, there's about £3.6 million of funding of that funding is capital. So, prudential borrowing in reality therefore funds the shortfall between the capital bids that we are approving and also the difference between the funding we have from revenue and from capital grants. Table 13 picks up the additional funding that we seek, or schemes we're seeking to put in. Colleagues will note my second mistake in my report there in 22-23 for NCC. It obviously isn't £112 million, it's £12 million. And I do promise to amend the errors in this report before it goes to council. From paragraph 168 onwards, we pick up some of the key investments that are in the programme. So the final funding tranche for the Spennymoor Primary School replacement. So it's a £14.3 million scheme. So the final £6.9 million is coming in here. The next tranche of funding for the Belmont school schemes, that's a £34 million scheme. So we're putting it for that, another £15 million going in now. One of our big investments in this programme, beyond what we've done in the past, is a significant investment in highways infrastructure. So the council's seeking to invest significant sums beyond our grant funding from government, and particularly an investment there in our unclassified road network. Our classified road network is above national standards, but our unclassified road network is below national standards. So an investment over the next 2 or 3 years of close to £14 million, seeking to bring our unclassified road network up to national averages. Again, I think in scrutiny, last time we discussed climate change investment. There's a £5 million capital investment going into the capital programme, including £2.5 million next year for 22-23. This will particularly be prioritised towards the heating of our buildings. So we're doing two key things in the MTFP for climate change linked to vehicles and our buildings. And when it comes to vehicles, that's a revenue budget pressure because we lease our vehicles. And over the next few years, we'll be looking to replace our smaller vehicles, which are broadly self-financing. So the extra cost of leasing them is balanced by the saving on diesel. However, as we get towards our major vehicles, such as bin wagons, they are very clearly not self-financing. So in our MTFP plan for 25-6, we've got the beginnings of the budget pressure landing for changing our fleet from normally aspirated to electric vehicles. And we think by the time we get to 2028-29, we'll have replaced all of our fleet with electric vehicles, and the additional revenue running cost for that linked to leasing will be around £8 to £9 million a year. On the capital side, the key issue we need to do is to move away from gas boilers and move more towards heat pumps. Again, that's a massive significant investment both in the council estate but also our school estate. We obviously are trying to seek government funding and government support to fund this, but to support that in terms of match funding in particular against government funding bids, this is the beginning of our capital investment to enable investment in our buildings. So £5 million going in to MTFP 12. Needless to say, this will be the beginning of what will need to be significant investments as we head towards our 2030 targets. So the new capital programme at table 14, there you can see kind of a significant programme of over £600 million invested into the council's capital programme. This level of investment is taking the council's borrowing to significant levels. It may well be, we think, as we go forward, our ability to keep investing heavily in capital may well be significantly restricted, linked to what the council's financial position could be. And the council may have decisions in the future between maintaining a significant capital programme against protecting our services. So, Chair, I've got no intention at this stage going through loads more detail in the rest of the report. I think there's only about another 170 pages in there. But obviously, we've got a whole range of recommendations in here and significant appendices in there in terms of providing full detail on our savings, our investments, our capital programme, our pay policy, and also in there is full detail on the council's treasury management policies as well. So, Chair, I'll leave it at that and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. At that moment, I'll open it up to the committee for any questions or comments they'd like to make on this. Okay, first up is Councillor Crute.
Thank you, Chair. And before I start, I'd like to pass on my thanks to Jeff for compiling this report. He always does it in such an impressive way, where you can get all the information into so many pages, but narrow it down to, the 20-minute presentation. It's quite impressive. I only wish we could find a way to write reports that didn't have uncertainty written through them, but as it is, uncertainty has been written through every MTFP report as far back as I can remember, and unfortunately this year's no exception. But on page 37, the section from paragraph 100 onwards gives me particular cause for concern this time around, and that's because it suggests that while services should remain deliverable next year, there are real and serious risks to budgets and frontline service delivery in each of the following years. Now, there's going to be a considerable hole in the council's budgets after this year's settlement. So what options are going to be available to the council to offset pressures to budget in coming years, especially if the worst case scenario is realised and inflation continues on an upward trend, we lose all of the services grant as we've assumed, and council tax increases and government grants prove insufficient to keep up with ongoing spending pressures, and that's a term that's actually used in paragraph 100. There's also a realistic chance that we could lose out from the fair funding review, and I think we need some clarity on this as well, because one section of the report suggests that there'll be significant impact beyond 22-23 as a result of the fair funding review, but another section suggests that whilst we lose the services grant, there shouldn't be any further pressures from the fair funding review. There's two issues from that. First off, I think it's almost certain we're going to lose the services grant, because it's a one-off, so that's 8.8 million gone to start with. But I've always been under the impression that the main risk through the fair funding review would be the loss of public health funding. Now, that seems to have been missed out of the assumptions this time around, and I don't really know the reasons behind that, so Jeff might be able to explain that. There seems to be a little bit of confusion around that and one or two other issues. So given the risks to council budgets in the years ahead, it would be helpful to have an accurate estimate of where we're going to stand financially after this year, and then have some idea of what options are going to be available to address those risks. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, I can assure Councillor Crute I'm not confused about it, but I'm definitely uncertain, as he mentioned. I'll pick those two issues up one by one. In terms of trying to take an accurate view of what's going to happen in the future, I think for all of us it's impossible to take an accurate view. Colleagues will recall in the past we've often been very prudent in our assumptions in terms of what might happen in terms of funding reduction. And normally what I used to do was look at the Red Book published by government, look at what we thought was going to happen for local government, apply that to Durham, and then probably put an extra 25% on top just in case. And every year it seemed to be the 25% manifest. Colleagues thought I was being a genius because I was always close to what the actual figures were. Actually, I wasn't. I was just putting in a contingency just in case I was wrong. So what would we do in terms of planning? Obviously, as Scrutiny would fully expect, The Director and myself have a meeting next week to devise the timetable for MTFP 13. So as soon as the budget's put to bed, we're into planning for MTFP 13. As part of that process, we've got a £16.6 million forecast shortfall at the present time in 23-24. We will be working, therefore, within the Councillors' offices and with members across the next 6 to 9 months to identify possible savings, I would have thought possibly in excess of £16.6 million, to ensure that we have options on the table if we need to move. The problem the Council would have in that circumstance is we won't know if we need to move until the results of the Fair Funding Review and the next settlement, particularly around the social care levy funding, are known. So if we do face a significant pressure in 23-24 and we aren't able to make the savings quickly enough, that is exactly what the Budget Support Reserve was invented for, to enable us to provide that time period where Council can very carefully think about the impact of savings. Now then, at the same time, what you'd expect me to say quite rightly is at all times we will be scouring every budget to identify, do we have other options for reducing costs or increasing income, to try and offset any impact that we might have on services in any way. So I can reassure Scrutiny that as officers we will be putting plans in place on the basis of the worst scenarios, identifying savings that are possible, and if we have to then consult on that, full consultation process is being carried out wherever we need to do so, and quality impact assessments being carried out to ensure we know what we're doing and the impact of what we're doing. And standing behind us will be the Budget Support Reserve to buy us time if we need it. In terms of the planning for the Fair Funding Review, Councillor Crute is correct. In the past, we were assuming that we always thought we would be partial winners from part of the Fair Funding Review. And I won't bore colleagues on all of that, but it's mainly linked to council tax equalisation. Because our council tax base is very low and others are very high, the current funding stream doesn't do full council tax equalisation. We are expecting that a new Fair Funding Review would build in significantly higher levels of council tax equalisation. However, being cautious, I'm assuming it won't be 100%, which actually would be the fair outcome. I'm working on the basis of its 85% council tax equalisation. On that basis, there are certain parts of the Fair Funding Review linked to that where we are beneficiaries. There are many areas, nearly all of the funding formula that underpin it around older people, younger people, everything else. We lose on most of them, but we gain massively on the council tax equalisation. And that's why in the past we were assuming we would win on parts of fair funding but lose, as Councillor Crute said, on the public health grant. And that always had a situation where we were forecasting around a £10 million loss for fair funding. What we built into this plan is we've just assumed that we don't get the services grant of 8.8 million. So within our planning, we're broadly in the same place as we used to be. We used to assume we're losing 10 million, we now assume we're losing 8.8 million. On the public health grant previously was forecast to come into business rate retention on the back of us moving to 75% business rate retention. The Minister, Mr Gove, has made it clear that he has no intention of moving local government at this point to 75% business rate retention. We'll be staying at 50%. On that basis, the public health grant will not get poured into the sausage machine of local government funding. It will stay as a specific grant. Now, that doesn't mean the government doesn't apply the ACRA formula to the public health grant. However, if that was the case, it would stand out like a sore thumb that that grant for Durham County was getting reduced. And it would be a very bold government, I think, to do that, to reduce our grant by so much, openly, transparently, when we've come through the pandemic. Durham has been hit hard by the pandemic, and also on the recent publication of life expectancy figure, particularly in the north and the northeast. So I do think there's a reducing risk in terms of us losing £18 million of public health grant. It wouldn't surprise me if there was something happened that we might lose small parts of that, but I don't think anywhere near as would have been the case in the past. All those things could come to pass. I might be sitting here next year and you're all telling me I was wrong. I'm hoping that isn't the case. I'm hoping I'm still here in a year's time, actually. And on that circumstance, I think the position we've taken is balanced, that we used to always think we'd lose £10 million. we're still building in an assumption of losing £8.8 million. So I think on that basis, Councillor Crute's right, we're trying to balance the position. I just think in terms of where we were previously, it's just a change in presentation of what we're thinking.
Can I just come back briefly on that? Now, I have concerns that we do actually have a government bold enough to do that. I know Jeff might not share those concerns, but as somebody involved in local politics for a long time, it does concern me that we have a government that doesn't know any boundaries when it comes to austerity and taking away from money where it's most needed. We tend to receive money through bidding contests these days rather than through areas of need. And on that £8.8 million of service grant, I mean, it's fantastic to get that level of money, but we've never had it before and we've never had it again. And that seems to, in a click, take away that risk of losing from a fair funding review. Jeff will be right in his assumptions, but I still have serious concerns about what's going to happen through the fair funding review if they use that accurate formula. And I still think they'll do that, and they'll find some way of taking money away from Durham and putting it somewhere else, which they've always done in the past. I don't believe that Leopard's changed the spots, but we can't see that far ahead. We don't know that for a fact. What I wanted to do this morning was to make sure that we're all aware of the huge hole in the budget and what options we're going to have available to backfill that gap. I've got serious concerns about what's happening at the moment, but I've got more serious concerns about what's likely to happen in the future and what capacity we're going to have in being able to address those, the huge concerns that we have and the pressures on budgets in the years ahead, certainly through the remaining years of this MTFP, but onwards as well. Real concerns. So I think we need to make clear note of that because I have, real concerns about the future.
Thank you. Anyway, is there next, Councillor Jopling.
Thank you, Chair. I was actually going to ask the question about the shortfall. I agree with a lot of what you say. But with COVID, with what's happened with COVID, we have to be realistic with our aspirations. And as a council, we've got to look at ourselves. I look at this budget and I think it's a very good budget. I think that we're doing pretty well. I'm very pleased that we are investing money in lots of different core services. What I'd like to know is the 29.98 million shortfall. That's what we've got to try and deal with. And reducing services is not going to go down well at all. And I wouldn't want to see that in any way. And I don't think this administration, the joint administration, would want to see that. Jeff, do you think that we can look at bringing in more income, looking at our assets to bring in more income? And as you say, you're always looking for efficiencies, and there are always efficiencies out there. And what I'd like to know is how can councillors feed in to that process if we sort of pick up something and think, oh, we could either enhance that and make a bit more, bring in a bit more revenue, or where we can make savings, because I think that councillors can be very useful in that regard.
Yeah, I think as was mentioned before, as Scrutiny will be aware, we've been going through a process of identifying savings within the council actively, robustly, since 2009-10. We started off doing it when we came through local government reorganisation, when we had to find, I think it was £25 million of savings on the back of the reorganisation, then quickly rolled then into the austerity period, if I dare call it that, where I think in the first year, 2011-12, the council saved £66 million in 1 year. So at the moment we're saying £30 million across 3 years. However, the difference between then and now is the easy decisions were made previously. But as Councillor Jopling says, that should never stop us from identifying if we think there's anywhere we can either, one, find efficiencies, two, disinvest from a service that may not be a priority for members or for the public, or generate additional income. And If colleagues go back through council reports in the past and look at every single year's savings that we brought forward, every year there would be a mixture, a sprinkling of those three things. Impact on services, minimised wherever possible. Lots of extra income being generated, particularly from charging for services, which in reality it was often not popular, or often finding significant efficiency savings as a council. In terms of how members can kind of be part of that process, I think as we mentioned last time, I think Scrutiny is a great place for those discussions, and if Scrutiny do think there's any area of the council where we can become more efficient or generate extra income, or that where something should be looked at, I'm sure Scrutiny can look at some of those areas. In areas such as assets, what an interesting one in assets, of course, is if we disinvest from assets and sell our buildings, our land, that's a capital receipt, and capital receipts must be invested in the council's capital programme. So if we sold a piece of land for £10 million, that isn't a £10 million benefit to the revenue budget. It's a one-off capital receipt that supports the capital programme. Notionally, that could reduce our borrowing, but obviously we tend to borrow over 40, 50 years, so that £10 million benefit you can divide by 40 or 50 in terms of the benefit to the revenue budget. However, if we generate rental income from buildings, that's revenue, or rental income from land. So my honest opinion in terms of the ability to generate efficiencies, extra income, or areas such as that, if I thought we could do that now and have a really good look, if we got beyond £3 million, I would be stunned. More over £5 million, I haven't been doing my job correctly for the last 10 years. But that doesn't mean we don't look. So I would kind of say, if any member has got any area where you feel that we can make efficiencies, drive extra income, either speak to us as finance or speak to the portfolio holder for that functional area, or the head of service, or the corporate director, because I can guarantee you over the next 2 or 3 months, every service is going to be looking at their services to start identifying savings to hit what could be a £16.6 million savings target for 23-24. So the opportune time now is now for any ideas in that regard. I would just caution yourselves to think that there are massive ability for the council to drive efficiencies or extra income. I promise you we have exhausted most of them. Doesn't mean all of them, but most. So back to the point that councillors have made in the past, if we have to reach £30 million of savings, big if, could be less, but as Councillor Crude says, could be more. If we have to get to that level, we've got limited ability to do it easily.
Just to add to Jeff's response, I am lobbying cabinet members to make sure that in this next year, any kind of big decisions they make budgetary wise in terms of if they do consider cutting a service or they do consider looking at something else, does come to scrutiny well ahead of the final budget, so that we all get the chance as councillors to kind of go through what they're doing and critique, or if we don't like what they're doing, suggesting alternatives that where we can find that money elsewhere. So I am lobbying to try and make sure that all of us get as much of a say as early as we can on any major budgetary decisions. I don't have anyone else to speak, so... Thank you very much. I thought it was going to be a short one there. Councillor Surtees.
Thank you, Chair. Jeff, thanks very much for that report and for all the work that the financial teams do. It's greatly appreciated. Jeff, I just want to ask a question about the earmarked reserves. There's a part of the report in here that goes through the reserves that have been reprofiled. I would just, maybe not necessarily for this meeting, but I'd like to see like a full list of last year's earmarked reserves against this year's earmarked reserves, I suppose in a way to see which ones have been plundered to release that money. Thank you very much.
The list of reserves that the council has, earmarked reserves, are always detailed in the forecast of outturn reports. I can guarantee for Councillor Surtees that the Q3 Cabinet report that will go in March on forecast of outturn, that we're slightly rejigging the format of that for the future to provide more detail, but within that table will be the identification of the reserves where the sums have been transferred to and from.
Sorry, is it possible to get that information sooner than March, please? If you've already got that information, you know which reserves these cuts have come from, I suppose. I would really appreciate to have a look at that sooner rather than later. Thank you. Not wait for a Cabinet report.
Yep, happy to send that to yourselves as Scrutiny Chair and for yourselves to circulate that around members.
Thank you. Councillor Elmer.
Thank you, Jeff. I just want to present a thought, really, in relation to the potential for future savings in relation to highways spending. Obviously, we're investing in highways. There's some significant capital investments that have been laid out here with regards to highways and maintenance infrastructure, the unclassified road network. These are all fairly large sums of money going in. And my point is, when you build new roads, you're then increasing the burden on the council for the cost of maintaining those new roads. And it's a sort of ever increasing prophecy, I suppose. What we need to do is plan a strategy through which we get more people onto public transport, walking and cycling. And of course, the infrastructure connected with those sorts of modes of transport is much, much cheaper to maintain as well. And of course, enabling that transition also helps with our carbon targets. At the moment, we seem to be locked into almost the opposite. The big money's going into ever expansion of the road network. Obviously, once you do expand the road network for cars, you need to keep on top of the maintenance. So I just wondered what your thoughts are on going forward in relation to reversing that situation.
Interesting point. I guess the issue there for myself in the short term is that I think I'm not aware of other than one. I think all of the investment that the council's putting in is into highways maintenance of the current network, no expansion of the network. I'm trying to think. I think the Toftill bypass might be the only expansion of the network that I think is presently planned in programme. Obviously, notwithstanding that's part of the levelling up bid for Bishop Auckland area. So I don't think necessarily that as a county we are massively expanding our network per se. Notwithstanding that, going forward, if we could make savings in terms of our highways maintenance spend in any way, obviously the key thing to identify there would be back to a previous point I made, highways investment is capital. So any saving on the highways side, which is either in the main, if we're putting more money in, is funded from council borrowing. There's a benefit then on the revenue side because I'll call it loosely, mortgage that we have to pay on our borrowing, which we tend to take over 40, 50 years period. So if we saved £1 million in our highways maintenance programme using a 40-year borrowing, that would save us £25,000 in revenue. So again, it's an option, but the saving it helps drive into revenue is not significant. So yes, I'm not really aware necessarily. There could be some, I apologise if I'm missing something, but I don't think there's plans in our current capital programme for a significant expansion of the network.
Thank you. Councillor Marshall.
Thanks, Chair. I've got sort of 3 blocks of questions, if you like, so I'll just work through each block and then I'll just pause until I get an answer, then move on to the next one so I can sort them out, if that's all right. So I think obviously there's a lot of uncertainty which Jeff has been through about future years of the MTFP, and I think probably the most difficult decisions for us in the current round our current term are going to be decisions that we have to take in the future with the 40 million plus cuts. But Jeff, I wanted to particularly pick up some of the costs on the building running costs we have as an authority. And in particular in relation to some of the savings that have been built into the MTFP around the council's new HQ down at the Sands. Now I noticed from within the budget report there is a saving that has been built in there, and I'm guessing that what you're going to see is that that will be subject to the review that we can expect over the next couple of months. But I wondered whether or not you can explain if there's been any mitigations in the budget for staying in this building. So obviously the rumours, and according to the media, Durham University Business School will be soon acquiring that building to flood with students and expand. And I think that from my point of view, there's two things with that. You know, if the council gets the £100 million that the building's worth, then will that go in to subsidise the capital programme? I think you've already answered that. But in particular, what's the revenue implications for us if we don't? Because not only do we have increased revenue costs on this building in relation to energy prices, gas and electric, but we'll also have maintenance that we'll have to do on this building to make it safe for staff returning to work if we're going to be in here any longer than had been planned. And also in terms of the budgetary envelope, in terms of any additional costs that we've incurred as a council from the delay from the judicial review that was brought about by the parish council into the sands. What were the costs to that? Because I think the information that I've seen, it sort of could be upwards of 1.7 million. So I think just some clarity around those budgets and cost savings relating to the new HQ and what might happen with the capital receipt that we'll receive from the university on that. And then I've got some that are unrelated to another area, Chair.
I'm getting worried now that Councillor Marshall said there's 3 elements to this, and I think the first question had 7 questions in it. Right. Yeah, I mean, Councillor Marshall's correct. There's nothing in this report that predicates the future decisions that are going to be made by Cabinet in terms of what happens with HQ. Again, Councillor Marshall is correct. The only thing that's in this report at this stage in terms of detail is the original Cabinet report about moving into the headquarters had a range of forecasts in terms of what the costs implications were going to be. So the capital cost was put into the capital programme, and we identified that, taking into account all of the different costs for different buildings as we move forward, there would be a £275,000 revenue saving from all of those building running costs, and that was put into future MTFP. At the present time, that saving is sitting in 23-24 in the plan. So if anybody wants to look at the MTFP model, which is I think Appendix 6 in the report, in 23-4 at our savings line, the £275,000 is sitting in 23-24 at the present time. And our original report to Cabinet did identify that as we came through this process, there would be likely double running costs, I think, as Councillor Marshall has referred to. And I'm pretty sure the original Cabinet report said any double running costs will be met from General Reserve. So I think that's how we said we would fund it. Now, as we go forward, quite naturally, what we would expect is any Cabinet report that comes forward, hopefully in the spring, in terms of options on HQ, will fully cover, again, each one of those 3 elements. Number 1, possible capital costs, which, as Councillor Marshall's referred to, could include taking into account a likely capital receipt if we sell. Number 2, we would have to look at double running costs. And number 3, there would have to be a firm reassessment of the ongoing revenue impact of all of those decisions. If the saving, is greater than the 275,000, that will help future MTFP. If the saving is less, that will be additional pressure into the MTFP in that regard. The only reference within the body of the report, Chair, in terms of the HQ issue is paragraph 109, and there's one paragraph in the report that references the issues that Councillor Marshall's referring to, and what we're identifying in here is that any costs incurred in 22-23 in terms of double running or anything else that happens, we're not going to meet from General Reserve, we're going to meet from general contingencies. So we're reflecting in here that whatever happens, there could be costs that come from that process. I think Councillor Marshall's final question in terms of cost linked to delay on the capital budget down at the Sands, again, we need to await what the decision is in terms of whether we go into the building or whether we don't, in terms of what the final capital position is going to be. Key reason being, we've got a chunky budget in place in the HQ capital budget for final fit out of the building, particularly equipment, furniture, things such as that. If we don't go into the building, we won't need to invest that part. So again, I would expect as part of this process as it rolls forward, there will be a firm assessment at that point in terms of whether we need to finally put more money into that HQ capital budget or not. If we have to, we will meet that from capital contingencies that we've set aside as part of our funding for the capital programme.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, I did make a point about the costs of bringing this building up to a decent standard for the staff over the obviously there's been a delay, but I'll move on if it's all right to totally unrelated item, Jeff. They weren't all linked. I wasn't trying to trip you up with anything. And this is just around the income the council can expect from fees and charges next year.
Yep. I'll answer that other question as well. Sorry, I forgot that one. Yeah, the issue about kind of this building and what the impact will be in this building will very much depend if we stay in this building or not, or whether as part of cabinet decisions options are put forward for still coming out of this building and doing something different. If that is the case, then the capital receipt generated from any sale would need to be used to fund other provision and could also be utilised to do kind of upgrades to current buildings as well. So would expect all of those things to be picked up in terms of reports on future of HQ and County Hall. As far as fees and charges are concerned, yes, kind of it has been one area as a council, I think back to Councillor Jopling's point, around an area where we've sought to maximise our funding in the past by increasing charging or charging for things we didn't previously charge for, but not taking charges at such a point that they became punitive or got to a point where people stopped buying our services. Our sales fees and charges budget, off the top of my head, it'll be in the Appendix 4 and 5, is over £100 million in terms of fees and charges. As a council, what we do every year, Finance work with services to take reports into their management teams to get approval for increases in fees and charges every year. In our base budget for next year, we've provided a 3% price inflation uplift to services on their expenditure budgets linked to what's happening with price inflation. That 3% price inflation uplift, however, is also applied against their income budgets. So in other words, I give services more money for price inflation on expenditure, but I take it off them for price inflation on fees and charges. So on average, services should be seeking, where possible, to increase their fees and charges next year by 3%. But each service grouping in the council has a cash limit budget. They're given a budget every year to manage within. If they underspend at the end of the year, they can carry forward as a cash limit reserve that they can utilise in the future. So services have had funding withdrawn from them linked to that 3% price inflation on sales fees and charges. It's for them then to finally decide how much they are going to increase their fees and charges by. Some might choose to increase it by 0 to drive extra demand. Some may feel they can increase it by more than that, but each management team every year has to decide and approve their own fees and charges uplifts.
Thanks. I think probably linked to that, Jeff, it would be helpful to maybe pick it up outside of the meeting, but it would be helpful to get an idea from you about what the total expected income is for fees and charges from the council, and specifically around rat catchers and pest control, please, if that's all right. Final point was around the EU structural funds, Jeff. I think, you know, it's been long debated within the council over a number of years around how County Durham was set to get a windfall of 300 million had we remained in the EU, and the government have always said that they would honour that commitment, that we would be no worse off having left the EU. It's obviously getting to a point now where some of the EU programmes we've got are going to have to be looking at winding down unless there's some certainties around the shared prosperity and the community renewal funding, which is set to replace them. And it was sad to see that within the information that was released last week, there wasn't a lot of certainty at all around those two funding schemes for County Durham, and the government didn't give that same commitment that they had done previously on that. So I wanted to know whether you could provide us with some information. Again, you might not have this to hand, but about how many staff do we currently employ, because I'm aware that it funds pretty much all of our sort of carbon reduction team and the excellent work that they do. It funds the Durham Work Scheme, it funds a lot of innovation and business support, a whole wealth of services that are provided to communities across the county. And there is a huge risk to us that if that funding is top sliced, that those services go. So it's just a case of, is there anything in this budget that looks to prepare for you know, losing those service areas, redundancy costs or anything like that. And if you can give us a figure on the total number of staff who potentially are at risk if the government don't follow through on the promise to give us a €300 million. Thanks, Jeff.
Yes, within the body of the report, I think it's paragraph 74D, we identify what the sums that the government's identified from the CSR for shared prosperity. So 400 million going up to 1.5 billion in 24/5. Little detail on this at the present time. I do believe, I think there may have been yesterday or the day before, some information came out on what the process may be, but I've got to admit it's still very light on detail. I'm pretty sure I did see something within the documentation mentioning the awful word bidding, which I think is a terrible process whereby organised councils have to bid for funding rather than being provided with funding. In terms of the risk for the council, Councillor Marshall is quite right to raise that our European funding streams do fund a wide range of investments across the county. Durham Works being an excellent example. I think the low carbon staffing, I'm pretty sure in the base budget for next year, we've now funded those in the base. So I think it was one of the ones where, in line with our net zero strategies, we recognise that actually we need to mainstream those posts for the future. I'll need to speak to our regen colleagues in terms of how many posts are funded directly from the European funding streams. They will mainly be within our regen service, but there could be some in other services such as education. I will need to kind of look in that in some detail and come back to Councillor Marshall. It's always a little bit like our capital programme. Our capital programme does actually, a lot of our staff who work in the capital programme are charged to the capital programme. Their costs are capitalised. So if you ever get into a circumstance in the future where you reduce our capital programme, it also has a likely impact upon staffing. But I will ask our regen colleagues, Chair, to identify for Councillor Marshall, and I'll drop Councillor Marshall an email on if we lost every single penny of our European funding, how many posts that puts at risk.
Thank you, Jeff. Councillor Adam.
Thanks, Chair. Councillor Adam, representing Aycliffe West. Jeff, can I direct you to paragraph 111 on page 52, where you identify additional frontline service investments. And in there, as said at our previous meeting, that obviously we welcome all those frontline service investments, and especially the ones in relation to low carbon development partnership officer, local nature recovery, woodland protection, in those areas of obviously that closely relate to the climate emergency response plan. And obviously going forward, we will be getting a new plan coming to Cabinet in March. But also, without preempting our discussions at overview and scrutiny for the environment on Monday in relation to declaring an ecological emergency, there is obviously going to be additional funding required if that is actually approved on Monday by the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. However, I don't see, in terms of the medium-term financial plan, 23, 25 up to 26, of any investment in that particular area. And I'd just like to know what your thoughts on that would be, or whether you can direct me whether there is actually investment in terms of the ongoing possibility of an ecological emergency. And Chair, I have actually got a second question, if you don't mind. Thanks, Jeff.
Yes, Chair. Councillor Adams, right. There's nothing in this report in that regard. I guess that needs to be adopted as a clear policy and strategy for the council. And at that point, clarity provided in terms of likely costs of that. Colleagues will recall when we agreed previously in full council to our climate change net zero strategy, it didn't come with a pound sign attached to it. Nobody agreed at that point how much it was going to cost, when actually we all fully understand it's going to cost millions and millions of capital investment and millions of pounds of revenue investment. And as all organisations and as a country, there's choices going to have to be made if we're going to have to invest at that level, what therefore doesn't get done. And that's going to be the same issue for us as a council in terms of meeting our climate change investments, as I mentioned previously, in terms of electric vehicles. If that puts £8 million of budget pressure into later MTFPs, if we don't receive additional funding from government, as Cabinet members and scrutiny colleagues, you're going to have to decide what services in the council you cut to fund the £8 million we need to electrify the council's fleet. When it comes to the ecological emergency, if that is agreed and accepted, my preference would be that it comes with a fully costed plan for what we're going to need to do. So as scrutiny members, cabinet members, council members, you are fully clear when you're committing to that, what financial liability you're also committing to at the same time. So at the present time, there's nothing in here because I've not been advised what the financial plan is in terms of meeting those requirements for the future. But again, as I would always say to yourselves, committing to those things, the same as committing to the growth that Councillor Adams just identified in here. There's £3 million of budget growth in here linked to frontline investments, all of them very laudable priorities for the council. But going forward, that's increasing our future savings target by £3 million. So always as members, you've got those choices between investing in services that are your priority and you want to do, but recognising that in the end you were then left eventually with decisions on having to find savings.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate your honesty in terms of going forward with regards to that, and I'm sure the Overview and Scrutiny Committee will take licence of what you've said there. My second question is in relation to the same paragraph, 111, but relates to item G, which is the issue about pest control. And previously at this particular committee, Councillor Joplin raised a question about funding and possible income with relation to pest control, and she was given an answer that the service could be free, possibly be free to certain individuals under the welfare fund that we have for that use. However, subsequently, what I've seen just this week, a statement and an article that indicates that pest control is actually going to be free for all in our community. Jeff, if it's free to all, do we actually have a costing for that? But also, it would seem to me to be contrary to what actually is stated in this report, where we're actually going to receive additional £10,000 income from domestic pest control treatment. So it's just a bit of a clarification, Chair, whether there's a bit of contradiction in the report or within an article that I've already seen this week. Thank you.
Yeah, news to me, that one, in terms of pest control being free to all, but it doesn't mean it isn't correct. I don't know everything that happens within the council. I will certainly find out if that's the case, because if it is the case, then as Councillor Adams said, that £10,000 reference in there would be superfluous to the council's budget report. One thing to stress for everybody, the council spends £1.1 billion a year. We have over £100 million of sales fees, charges, income. When services are managing their budgets, every single decision that is made in terms of charging, efficiencies, don't necessarily come into the budget. So in my own budget, sometimes I face budget pressures in part of my budget. I find an efficiency somewhere else in my budget and I move the money around. That's my responsibility in my own cash limit. So every tiny thing that we do, or major thing that we do, doesn't necessarily fall into the council's budget. So back to the point when Councillor Marshall asked the question about fees and charges. Services can make a choice to vary their fees and charges. If they reduce them, they have to find the money themselves. They don't get a corporate bailout. But I have to admit, I'm not aware that anybody has agreed to take off all pest control charges. But now Councillor Adams raised it, I will certainly try and find out on his behalf if that's the case.
Thank you. Councillor Howie.
Good morning, Councillor Howie from Goodhouse Close Division. Thank you for the report there, Jeff. It was just a quick one, really. We keep it, as a joint administration, we want to keep the council tax at 0% core rate, base rate, and I really appreciate, though, that we do need to put some money into the social care system to help with that, because it is at a terrible low at the moment, and we do need to help with that more. I'm just thinking, I know it's not long-term savings and it doesn't save loads, but if we start to get on top of investing on things like the pest control, the streets, the roads, the paths, is that then going to start saving us money in the long term with having to make fixing things and helping with getting things up to, you know, at the moment where we are in Hennell, there's an estate that has been ignored for so long, and at last, after 8 months, we're getting it fixed, but it's costing a lot more because it's been left to rack and ruin for so long. So it's cost more in the long run to fix that. So if we start getting on top of this, does that mean we're going to start saving money because we're on top of fixing all of this and bringing it up to the standard it should be? Thank you.
I think it's, as we all know, one of the short-term or short-sighted arrangements in terms of finding savings in austerity is that often maintenance programmes get cut. Because you just start cutting your maintenance budgets, and it allows you then to kind of make savings going forward. It gets extra cost then going forward because you haven't maintained for long enough. As a council, we've never cut our highways maintenance budget. It's, I think when we did, some members who have been here for a while will remember the monopoly boards that we did with the APs. I've never thought I'd play Monopoly with APs, but we did it a number of years ago. And on the back of the process that we went through, the public came forward at that point as part of that massive consultation and identified 4 or 5 service areas where they said, whatever happens, you will protect this service. One was highways maintenance. The second one was winter maintenance, which we've never touched. In fact, we continue to put more money into winter maintenance. Children's services, adult services were the main ones that were protected. So actually, we've never cut our highways maintenance budget. I can hold my hands up and say we did cut our building maintenance budget. And again, now if you speak to our property people, they would advise that they're now facing pressures because we cut the budget in the past and no doubt will be seeking growth in the future. So just to reassure members that the previous administration and the current administration continue to invest more money every year than we did the year before in highways maintenance. However, if you spoke to our highways colleagues, and I'm sure as Councillor Howie's identified, that doesn't mean that we are maintaining all pathways and roadways to a level and a standard that we may wish to do so, but I guess what we're saying is we're doing it to a level that we can afford to do so. If we could do more substantial investment in our highways infrastructure, we have a big capital budget that does that every year. We get some funding from government through grant, but as is mentioned in this report, we tend to go well beyond that. So the government's broadly saying to us, this is how much you need as a council to invest in your highways. We invest well beyond that and always have done. But we've still got a £170–180 million backlog on highways maintenance. If we were able to invest much more in the highway, we do have a small revenue highways maintenance budget, which is mainly for patching. So if we got loads more capital from government to invest in the maintenance programme, then yes, there could on the back of that be some small savings in our revenue budget on highways from not having to patch as often. But I guess what our highways colleagues would say is to get there, we need to eradicate the £170 million backlog that we've got.
Thank you very much. Councillor Jopling.
Thank you, Chair. Jeff, this is just an add-on to what I spoke to you about earlier on. I think you might have got the wrong idea. My suggestion was not to put up fees for the services that we provide. My suggestion would be that we add value. We add value to what we're doing. So in other words, we look at other areas to see what we can provide to add value to what comes into the council. So that really, sorry if I didn't make myself clear. The thing about Eddie's pest control that I brought up previously, the thing that I find very difficult to resolve when it comes to pest control is that if you ask for someone to go out from pest control, yes, they want this money, but if it's a Believe Housing or any housing association house, they then say you need to go to that housing association. It is their responsibility if it's their property. So I think we need to do some work with the housing associations to try and clarify whose responsibility it is, because I get it every time. We've got a lot of Believe housing in our area, and I get that all the time.
I think that might be an issue you need to take up with another service area rather than a budget-specific kind of point.
Yeah, and also the other point was I want to thank Councillor Marshall for informing us that we're going to get 100 million for the new HQ, because it was one of the most unpopular builds, I think, that we've ever done. And I think that the public out there are going to be absolutely delighted that we've actually remedied that. So thank you, Carl.
I don't think there are any specific questions there, Jeff, for you.
I've got loads of answers, though. And yeah, if we get £100 million for selling that building, yeah, kind of, I'll be absolutely gobsmacked, stunned, and beyond. One thing I would just add for Councillor Jopling, I think, needless to say, for lots of the staff who work in the county council, lots of the staff were looking forward to going into a gorgeous brand new building, which has got modern technology and would enable us to work in a hybrid fashion going forward. As it is now, staff are going to come back into County Hall, which in no way is set up for modern ways of working. So, as always, there's two sides to that coin. But we don't make decisions, it's members who make decisions. On the Believe housing issue, when in the past district councils and the county council went through council housing stock transfer, so as members will be aware, 4 or 5 years ago we went through stock transfer and transferred the county council at that point 19,000 council houses. As part of the funding agreement, as part of that transfer, certain responsibilities were given to the registered social landlords, and one of them was pest control. So it's very clearly in the legal agreement between parties when it comes to housing for some of the RSLs. I don't know if it's all, but for some of them, it is their responsibility and not the county councils. And more than happy for Councillor Jopling to add any value, or any member, in terms of identifying any areas where we can generate extra income.
Thank you. Councillor Colt.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Jeff. Jeff, it's just a really quick question around the investment that's going to be put into unclassified roads, and it's really just how council are going to ensure that we get the best value of money from the contractors. And the reason I'm asking this, Jeff, is in the ward I serve, I've had at least 3 occasions where roadworks have been done and they haven't been done to appropriate standard, and it's ended up costing more to get it redone again or have it patched temporarily till it was then redone. Thanks, Jeff.
Now, that's the question I can't answer. Yeah, I'll only say 2 things on that. One, yeah, I'll have to get some information from Highways colleagues in terms of their procurement process, and I guess what Councillor Colt's asking for is particularly around quality, in terms of quality checking. And one thing, obviously, to kind of identify the vast majority, and I mean vast majority of the Council's capital programme for highways, the works are done by ourselves, with our in-house team. Obviously, what then happens is, in recent years and in this programme, when we start putting in an awful lot more capital into our programme, then, as Councillor Colt's identifying, proportions of that then are outsourced to the private sector. We can't massively grow our workforce internally to meet that, because in 2 years' time, our capital investment might need to reduce, and then we'd be left with too many people. So we have a core workforce who do the vast majority of our highways maintenance, and I would hope that our in-house team are very high quality. But yes, because of our extra investment we've been putting in recent years and in this MTFP, proportions of our work need to go out to the private sector. But on that one, Chair, I'll get our highways guys to drop Councillor Colt an email in terms of what their quality standard arrangements are.
Thank you. Councillor Moist.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jeff. As like most good reports, there's more information comes out in the following questions, which is great. It's great to be involved. You mentioned hybrid working with the new HQ, and what's one point I was going to raise. Since the decision to build a new HQ, we have had COVID. We've all had to be educated in new ways of working. Do we really need a new HQ like was built on the riverside, Or is it better that we embrace the new ways of working and work from home and get even more savings than the £275,000 that Councillor Marshall explained were due to be applied? However, that's over a 100-year payback on the capital cost, which doesn't seem very good return. However, I think we should look at new ways of working to embrace the savings that are possible. The climate change, I think my colleague Councillor Elmer will agree, we reap what we sow. There is going to be massive costs and we have to bite the bullet. It's going to be our decision to do that, and we have to make some tough decisions. But suggestions for revenues, there's one in mind which is close to my heart, which is the Durham County Cricket Club, which was handed over to this authority by Chester Street District Council, and they currently pay £1 per year for a 999-year lease. Is there any possibility of looking at the legalities of something that was done previously to perhaps increase the revenue? Because I think we can all agree that is a trifling amount. EU funding was looked on. Can I just ask Jeff, was the EU funding that we're talking about, was it time limited anyway? Any EU funding schemes I've been involved with had been time limited, and we'd always applied appropriate measures for the end of that grant. So it's not as if they may not be unexpected. And basically that's it. I look forward to leaving this building. I think we could do with a smaller building. I'm only a new councillor, but we don't need a massive, massive civic centre these days. Everybody is looking at working in new, efficient ways, and I think we embrace it. Thank you, Jeff.
Just before Jeff comes in there, I don't want the meeting to we veer off into a kind of larger debate on whether we need a new HQ or not, we will be looking at this in scrutiny when we get the feasibility study back from Cabinet, hopefully. But yeah, Jeff.
Sorry, absolutely right. I was just responding to...
Oh, don't worry, Councillor. I completely appreciate the fact that a lot of the comments you were making were financial questions, but I just wanted to make sure we're not veering off this committee into a debate into something that we really should be looking at in more detail when we've got more information on the future. Thank you for your question. Jeff.
Yeah, so on that basis, I'll not say too much about the first part of the question that Councillor Moyes raised. On the new headquarters, so I would always, if you're looking at scrutiny at this in the future, I would always recommend that you look back at the original reports on the headquarters decision. The full financial analysis is in there in terms of the efficacy of the decision at the time. So yeah, the saving was only £275,000 on revenue, but the capital saving in terms of not having to maintain this building would have been phenomenal. But obviously kind of that capital cost wasn't in the budget, so it couldn't be a saving. It was an opportunity saving of money we wouldn't have to spend in the future. But yes, it was only £275,000 revenue. In terms of hybrid working, the new headquarters was based upon a 5.5 to 10 desk ratio. So there was only about 600 desks in that building. There's about 1,600 desks in County Hall. So that building was much smaller, and it was based upon us moving to a hybrid working model. So that building was already built on the basis of efficiency, moving towards a hybrid working model. We've all been asked now to come back into work 3 days a week. If somebody said to me that my finance team was going to be working from home every day forever, that would be one of the most inefficient things I'd ever heard in my life. Having people not working together, collaborating, young members of staff learning from more experienced members of staff, helping Frontline, that you can't get that working from home. So I think the 3 to 2 is about where as a council we need to be. There are some colleagues who work in a transactional work who already work from home full time. I think home working for transactional staff permanently can work, but professional staff and staff supporting people in other services like in resources, people need to be in the office more than not. So I think the 3 to 2 that the Chief Exec is recommending now is about right for hybrid working for the future. The Cricket Club, Councillor Moyes is right, it's a 999-year lease for £1. That was probably made 20, 30 years ago. For the first time at the present time, probably for 10 years, the Cricket Club is just about breaking even. For my sins, I was on the Cricket Club board for about 5 years after we provided them with financial support back in 2013 before the Ashes, and we fought very hard to help the Cricket Club to move themselves to a situation where they were breaking even, which they are right now, which is really good news, I'm sure we would all say. The funding that the council put into the cricket club previously has been paid back. So we've now received well over almost close to £2 million back, on the back of them being much more fundamentally secure. I'm not too sure the county council then wanting to charge them rent on their land might necessarily be a brilliant idea, based upon an old legal agreement, just when they're getting themselves onto a firm footing. I guess it's an interesting point to consider for the future, however, if we suddenly find that the cricket club is making significant profits, which has never been the case in my experience in the past. So I'm not quite sure now is the time to look at that one, but it doesn't mean that it's not one for the future if we do find that the club becomes much more secure. But so much is happening in national cricket right now. Who knows what's going to happen with cricket nationally regardless. Final one, the EU funding. Yes, as Councillor Moist identified, lots of the funding is time limited, so staff often are on short contracts. But obviously, because things like Durham Works have probably been in place now in its current form for 5-10 years, those contracts keep getting rolled over continually. So again, that's back to the question that Councillor Marshall raised about there will be a number of staff, whether they be temporary or some possibly substantive, who are kind of their positions are reliant upon the funding we've presently got.
Thank you. Councillor Hovels.
Thank you. I don't want to labour it, Chairman. Lucy Hovels, Thornley and Trimden Division. But it was around the question around the rats that was raised, because I do think that the cost does always land with the resident, whichever area it is. But often we demolish in big buildings in our communities, in particular schools or factories or whatever. And I don't know what the policy is, and maybe I should do, but I believe if that cost and that burden was put onto the company that was demolishing it and that treatment took place, the resident wouldn't be then having to pick it up. I do believe if it was built in within the contract, that could save our residents some money, and it would obviously help in terms of cost. And so it would make a suggestion, if we're not doing that, we should be. Thank you, Chair.
I'm going to become a rat expert, aren't I? I think. Yeah, the question raised by Councillor Altman, I'm not quite sure on that one. I'll go back to our property and land colleagues who do all of the demolitions for the council, and I'll ask the head of service to get in touch with Councillor Hovels in terms of, do we have any policies in our procurement process for demolition? Yeah, all of our demolitions are done externally. We don't demolish buildings, I don't think, ourselves. We always outsource those. So I'll ask the head of service to get in touch with Councillor Hovels.
Thank you. Councillor Stead.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Stead, Aycliffe North and Midridge. Just looking at, I've waited a little while to speak in scrutiny here today, because I thought we would see, the opinions of what people thought of the budget. And I think it's fair to say that the hard work that you've put in, and the members have put in, has certainly made it look pretty good. I've made some notes, really. You're on about savings and increase in income, and some ideas on that. Members here don't really know, I help people with small business, and quite often people get the bank statements out at the start of the month or the end of the month, and they're always looking at how they can take things off that bank statement, so i.e. make some savings. What can we save? Can we cancel a Netflix? Can we cancel sort of what we spend our money on, and where we can make savings? And it is a good thing to do from time to time, because you do get wins with it, and with the council being the size it is, we are in the right line to do that. We're looking at taking things out of that, but it does come to a point when you have a fridge there, you can only take a certain amount of food out of it. And when I've listened to Councillor Crute, we are heading towards uncertain times, and when there is uncertainty there, you have to sometimes sit and think, hang on a second here, I can look at the savings on this big bank statement that I have, but I've also got to look at the top bit, and the top bit's usually on people's bank statements as the first of the month or the end of the month when that money comes in. And I sometimes say to these people, I say, can we look at making that any larger? So when we come in to look at making some increased income, it always comes at a cost of needing to be something called ambitious, and we need to be a little bit ambitious. I think this budget's really good. It's fantastic. It's balanced. Ambition-wise, we have to look to increase revenue. You mentioned, Jeff, first of all, just to touch on it, you said you'd be astounded if there was 6 million found in income. Is that correct? Just quickly there.
Might have said 3 to 5, actually.
Oh wow, 3 to 5. Well,
I'm happy to be astounded.
I have something called the 10x rule, which is similar to when you said you're adding your 25% in there, and then everybody thinks you're amazing. I always times everything that I do by 10%, and then I reach for that. Some people say it's reaching for the clouds instead of the ceiling in a room, even though this ceiling's quite high. The income that would be produced if this council committed to purchasing and building our own bungalows, and the ease it would put on the property in the area as well, making more properties available, would be an absolutely fantastic idea. In my opinion, I'll say that while I'm on the mic. We have in Newton Aycliffe and North Aycliffe and Midridge, we actually have pension of poverty just on the council tax. We pay one of the highest council tax in the UK. There's people living in a 4-bedroomed or a 5-bedroomed house that the husband's passed away. These people are unable to move really. The children live down south. It's a lonely life, and they're rattling around in a big house. And I speak to them on the doorstep, and I kind of say, like, would you not consider my down south? And it's just that there. If we as a council said, right, an income stream would be for these people to move into a bungalow that we would provide and build. I mean, I've identified numbers of areas of land. I'll not go on with it anyway, but I mean, listening to what everybody said, when we're looking at savings of 275,000 on things, it's on a move on furniture. You didn't mention how much the furniture would cost for the potential HQ that we may well move into, or may not, depending on what the review is. What was that going to cost to fit out that? You mentioned it earlier, but you didn't say how much it was going to cost to put stuff in there, which is, I think it's important for us to know that. Maybe it'll come in the review, but I do think it's long overdue. Looking at how we can make income, be a little bit more entrepreneurial, be a little bit more adventurous, ambitious, and look at that. I've never liked when anyone struggles with money is to think, right, where's our next handout, when's our next money? And again, Councillor Crute's spot on, it's uncertain times. Everyone sat complimenting the budget, or some people didn't bother to compliment the budget, how it's been set out, but they do say we're heading towards uncertain times, and you make hay while you can. We've offered a 0% base council tax rise there, looking at what I've looked at anyway, and I think that's fantastic to the residents in this time. And then we've got 3% on the adult social care, which I think is necessary, Jeff. So I commend you on that. It's just really my comments about being more adventurous. That's what I'd like to say. Thank you, Chair.
I'll go back to my first comment. I'm Jeff Garfield, Head of Corporate Finance and Commercial Services. I think we're really ambitious as the council when it comes to our commercial approach. And I'll pick up on one or two of those as I go through answering Councillor Stead's questions. Bungalows. I think we were probably the first council to set up its own housing company about 4 or 5 years ago. So we've got Chapter Homes. Chapter Homes is out there working in the private sector, generating profits, paying loans to the county council, loans at interest rates that are generating investment income for the council. And I'm pretty sure in the future, thus far, I think the profit that's sitting in the balance sheet for Chapter is close to £2 million now. So in the future, I'm fully expecting that Chapter will start to pay a dividend to the County Council on the back of our ambitious house building programme in the private sector. In the public sector, the County Council agreed through Cabinet over a year ago to reset up the housing revenue account. So as I mentioned previously, we stock transferred our 19,000 council houses 4 or 5 years ago, mainly linked to massive restrictions on the ability to borrow in our housing revenue account. Subsequently, 3 or 4 years later, the government relaxed that. So the council agreed through Cabinet to reopen our housing revenue account to build 500 houses, being the target. The council put in £12.5 million of capital to fund that, or in the plan, because it needs subsidy from council and also needs HCA funding. And in that strategy, the clear expectation is that housing in the main is bungalows for older people. So our strategy on housing is twofold. One, private sector, step into the market, use our own land rather than selling our land to generate revenue for the council going forward. Secondary, public sector housing revenue account, targeting our own land in the main towards older persons' bungalows, notwithstanding the council's having to put in £12.5 million of capital to make that balance up. Must take Councillor Stead to task in terms of council having the highest council tax. As we've discussed previously, Durham's got one of the lowest council taxes in the country. Our Band D is high, but almost nobody in the county pays Band D. Most people pay bands A to C. The average council tax paid in the county, I think, is about 1,280. The average council tax paid in the country is 1,420. So we're in the lowest 25% of the council tax in the country. We are not anywhere near the highest on council tax. In terms of furniture in the HQ, it's not my budget, but I think the budget for furniture, total fit out, equipment that goes in, it's not just furniture, it's furniture, equipment, things for the council chambers, equipment for the cafes and things such as that. I think the budget is about £1.5 million.
Very much.
And also that would also be a budget for any new building that the council might go into.
Thank you. Thank you. At that point, I think we've thoroughly discussed this budget. Thank you very much for everybody's contributions, and thank you very much, Jeff, for answering those questions and having a go at the questions you didn't quite know the answer to. So at that point, the recommendation is that we consider the content of the report and provide any scrutiny comments, which will be factored into the final budget report to be submitted to full council on the 23rd of February 2022. Can we agree that? Thank you very much. Item 6, any other business? I have no other business. So at that point, I will conclude the meeting. Please, can you remain in your seats until we have confirmation that the broadcast has ended?